After the death of Henry I, England was on the brink of collapse. A brutal civil war known as the Monarchy had plunged the realm into chaos. For nearly 2 decades, the country was torn apart by a bitter struggle for the throne, with 2 rival factions locked in a seemingly endless conflict. Law and order crumbled, and the once mighty English monarchy teetered on the edge of ruin. The anarchy began in 1135 when King Henry I died without a legitimate male heir. His only son, William Adelin, had perished in the tragic White Ship disaster of 1120, leaving Henry with only one surviving legitimate child, his daughter Empress Matilda. Determined to secure the succession, Henry forced his barons to swear allegiance to Matilda as his rightful heir. But upon Henry's death, many of these same nobles abandoned their oaths, unwilling to accept a female ruler. Instead, they supported Stephen of Blois, Henry's nephew, who seized the throne and was crowned king. What followed was nearly 20 years of civil war. Neither Stephen nor Matilda could claim full control over England. Battles raged across the kingdom, castles changed hands repeatedly, and the once strong central government collapsed. But out of this chaos emerged a new ruler, Henry II of England. A man of ambition, intellect, and ruthless determination, Henry was the son of Empress Matilda and Geoffrey of Anjou. When Stephen died in 1154, Henry ascended the throne, ending the anarchy and beginning a new chapter in English history. Henry was the first king of the Plantagenet dynasty, and his reign would lay the foundation for one of the most powerful empires in medieval Europe. Henry II was born on March 5, 1133, in the city of Le Mans, France, as the eldest son of Empress Matilda and Geoffrey Plantagenet, Count of Anjou. His birth came at a time of political uncertainty, as England was already heading towards civil war due to the succession crisis caused by the death of his grandfather, King Henry I. Henry's heritage was extraordinary. On his mother's side, he was the grandson of King Henry I of England, making him a legitimate claimant to the English throne. The Norman blood of William the Conqueror also ran through his veins, linking him directly to England's first Norman king. His mother, Empress Matilda, was a strong-willed and ambitious woman who had been trained for leadership. She had even been married to Holy Roman Emperor Henry V, from whom she inherited the title Empress. After her first husband's death, she returned to England to fight for her claim to the throne, making Henry's upbringing one shaped by war and political struggle. On his father's side, Henry belonged to the powerful House of Anjou, a family known for its military skill and strategic marriages. His father, Geoffrey Plantagenet, was the Count of Anjou, Maine, and Touraine, territories in western France that were strategically important in the medieval world. Geoffrey was an experienced warrior and ruler, famous for his emblematic Plantagenet, from which the Plantagenet dynasty would later take its name. Henry's early years were shaped by the civil war raging in England, known as the Anarchy. His mother, Matilda, spent much of his childhood fighting King Stephen of Blois, who had seized the English throne after Henry I's death. As a result, Henry grew up in a world of constant war and shifting alliances, witnessing firsthand the brutality and chaos of medieval politics. His father, Geoffrey, focused on expanding his power in France, leaving Matilda to continue her war in England. Due to this instability, Henry spent most of his childhood in Normandy and Anjou rather than England. However, his education was never neglected. He received an excellent education, guided by some of the finest scholars of the time, including the famous medieval scholar Adelard of Bath. He studied Latin, history, and law, developing the keen intellect that would later define his rule. At just 14 years old, in 1147, Henry made his first attempt to claim the English throne. Without his parents' support, he gathered a small band of mercenaries and sailed to England, landing on the south coast. Though his forces were small, the boldness of the move shocked King Stephen. Henry lacked the resources to launch a full-scale campaign, and soon his money ran out. In a surprising turn of events, he sought financial help from his enemy, King Stephen himself. Stephen, either impressed by the young prince's bravery or wanting to avoid making an enemy of him, provided Henry with funds to return to Normandy. Although the expedition failed to secure the throne, it proved that Henry was fearless and already a leader in his own right. His reputation as a future king was growing. Henry's position changed dramatically in 1151, when his father Geoffrey Plantagenet died. As the eldest son, Henry inherited Anjou, Maine, and Touraine, making him one of the most powerful lords in France. His new role gave him an independent power base and solidified his status as a rising force in European politics. In 1152, Henry married Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful and influential women of the Middle Ages. Eleanor was one of the richest and most influential nobles in Europe, having inherited the vast Duchy of Aquitaine, which covered a significant portion of southern France. She had previously been married to King Louis VII of France, but their marriage ended in annulment due to political and personal conflicts. This alliance made Henry a direct rival to the King of France, as he now controlled more land in France than the French king himself. With his power base secured, Henry turned his attention to England. The civil war between King Stephen and Empress Matilda had left the country in ruins. Realizing that he could not maintain his grip on the throne forever, Stephen agreed to the Treaty of Wallingford in 1153. Under this treaty, Stephen would remain king for the rest of his life, but Henry would be recognized as his rightful heir. When Stephen died in 1154, Henry crossed the English Channel and was crowned King Henry II of England at just 21 years old. His ascension marked the end of the anarchy and the beginning of a new era. England had suffered nearly 2 decades of war, lawlessness, and instability, but Henry was determined to restore order and strengthen the monarchy. With his vast territory stretching from Scotland to the Pyrenees, Henry was not just the King of England, he was the ruler of a mighty Angevin empire, which would shape the future of medieval Europe. After nearly 2 decades of civil war, England had become a land of weakened royal control over mighty barons and lawlessness. Henry II recognized that if he were to rule effectively, he needed to reassert the power of the monarchy and curb the influence of rebellious nobles. His strategy for restoring royal authority focused on 3 key areas: controlling the barons, strengthening royal justice, and extending his influence over the church. During the anarchy, King Stephen had allowed the English nobility to gain unprecedented power, granting them vast lands and allowing them to fortify their positions with castles. Henry acted swiftly, dismantling of all adulterine castles, fortresses that had been built without royal permission during the Civil War. He also strengthened royal justice by sending judges across the kingdom to enforce the king's law. This system laid the groundwork for the English common law, which still influences legal systems today. To further secure his authority, Henry expanded the exchequer, the financial system of the crown. He ensured that taxes were collected efficiently, making the monarchy financially strong. Through these measures, Henry had a lasting impact, strengthening the central government and laying the groundwork for a more unified and legally coherent England. As Henry strengthened his rule in England, his ambitions stretched beyond his kingdom. His marriage to Eleanor of Aquitaine had made him one of the most powerful rulers in Western Europe, controlling vast lands in France. Henry's marriage to Eleanor had gained Aquitaine, one of the richest and largest duchies in France. This infuriated Louis, as it meant that Henry now controlled more land in France than he did, a direct challenge to the authority of King of France. Louis repeatedly tried to weaken Henry's position by supporting revolts against him, particularly by backing Henry's own rebellious sons in later years. The two kings clashed in multiple skirmishes, but Henry's superior military strategy often gave him the upper hand. Despite their rivalry, there were moments of uneasy peace. In 1158, Henry betrothed his young son Henry the Young King to Louis's daughter Margaret in an attempt to ease tensions. While Henry II had restored order in England, his ambitions extended across the English Channel. As Duke of Normandy and Anjou, he ruled more land in France than the French king himself. By the mid-12th century, Henry's vast territories in France made him the dominant power in Western Europe. However, Henry was not content with simply defending his existing domains. He sought to extend his authority further. One of his primary targets was Brittany, a strategically vital but politically fragmented region that bordered his lands. Brittany, though technically a duchy under the nominal suzerainty of the French king, had long been known for its independence. Its rulers often acted autonomously, balancing their allegiances between England and France, depending on political necessity. For Henry, control over Brittany was essential for several reasons. First, it would secure the western flank of his Angevin empire, preventing any hostile force from using it as a base to attack his lands. Second, it would further tighten the grip he held over France, encircling the Caspian kingdom from the north and west. The opportunity to intervene in Brittany arose in 1156, following a succession crisis. The previous Duke of Brittany, Eudes de Porhoët, had been acting as regent for his young stepson Duke Conan IV. However, Eudes attempted to seize power for himself, pushing Conan aside and claiming the duchy. This move led to a political crisis, as different factions within Brittany began aligning themselves with either Conan or Eudes. Henry, seeing a chance to assert his influence, threw his support behind Conan. Henry's interest in Brittany was also deeply personal. His younger brother Geoffrey had married Constance of Penthever, a prominent noblewoman from Brittany. This marriage gave Geoffrey a strong claim to influence in the region, and Henry sought to use this connection to extend his family's control. In 1156, Henry launched a campaign into Brittany using a combination of diplomacy and military force to crush Eudes' resistance. His army, consisting of troops from Normandy and Anjou, moved swiftly against Eudes' supporters, forcing them into submission. Conan regained control of the duchy. However, despite restoring Conan to power, Henry ensured that Brittany remained under his firm influence. After securing his dominance in Brittany, Henry turned his attention to Toulouse, a wealthy and strategically vital region in southern France. His claim came through Eleanor of Aquitaine, as Toulouse had historical ties to her duchy. However, it was ruled by Count Raymond V, a vassal of Louis of France. In 1159, Henry launched an ambitious military campaign to seize Toulouse, assembling one of the largest armies of his reign. As Henry's army advanced toward Toulouse, Raymond quickly realized that he could not withstand the attack on his own. Desperate for support, he turned to his feudal overlord Louis VII for protection. In a bold move, Louis personally entered Toulouse and took up residence in the city. This was a significant escalation, as it meant that any direct assault on Toulouse would be seen as an attack on the King of France himself. A direct assault on Toulouse risked triggering a much larger conflict, potentially uniting other French nobles against him. Faced with these risks, Henry hesitated. While this decision prevented an immediate diplomatic crisis, it was widely seen as a military failure for Henry. After the Toulouse campaign, tensions between Henry and Louis remained high. Their next major conflict centered on the Vexin, a crucial border region between Normandy and France. The Vexin had long been a disputed territory. It was originally controlled by the French crown, but had been promised as part of the dowry of Margaret of France, the infant daughter of Louis. She was betrothed to Henry's eldest son, Henry the young king, in a political arrangement meant to secure peace. However, Henry saw an opportunity to take advantage of the situation. In 1160, while Margaret was still a child, Henry arranged for an immediate marriage between her and his son, despite the fact that both were too young to consummate the union. This move, though legally questionable, allowed Henry to claim custody of Margaret and with her control of the Vexin. Louis VII was outraged. Seeing this as a power grab, he sought alliances, reaching out to other French nobles and strengthening his ties with the papal authority and the Holy Roman Empire. However, Henry's control over the Vexin remained secure, marking yet another victory in his ongoing struggle against the French monarchy. As Louis's influence waned, a new force was emerging. His young son, Philip Augustus, would one day prove to be a far more formidable adversary than his father. With his dominance in France secure for the moment, Henry turned his attention to consolidating power in England. One of his primary concerns was the growing influence of the Church, which often acted independently of royal authority. Henry sought to bring the English clergy under his control, leading to one of the most infamous conflicts of his reign, the struggle with Thomas Becket. To strengthen his hold over the Church, Henry appointed his close friend and trusted Chancellor Thomas Becket as Archbishop of Canterbury in 1162. Henry believed that Becket, who had been a loyal servant in secular affairs, would ensure that the Church remained loyal to the crown. However, this decision would prove disastrous. Once elevated to Archbishop, Becket underwent a dramatic transformation. He abandoned his lavish lifestyle, embraced monastic discipline, and became a fierce defender of church privileges. He clashed with Henry over clerical immunity, insisting that priests accused of crimes should be tried in church courts rather than under royal law. This directly opposed Henry's vision of a stronger, centralized monarchy where all subjects, including clergy, were answerable to the king's justice. Tensions escalated in 1164 when Henry introduced the Constitutions of Clarendon, a set of laws aimed at restricting church independence. These decrees asserted the king's authority over ecclesiastical courts, demanding that clergy be tried in royal courts for serious crimes. Becket refused to accept these reforms, challenging Henry's authority and seeking support from Pope Alexander III. Henry's clash with Thomas Becket over the Constitutions of Clarendon reached a breaking point. He was summoned to the king's court, where he was accused of treason and financial misconduct. Fearing for his safety, Becket fled to France, seeking protection from Pope Alexander and King Louis VII, Henry's longtime rival. For 6 years, Becket remained in exile, using his position to rally support against Henry. During this time, the Pope attempted to mediate, but neither Henry nor Becket would compromise. Henry, frustrated by Becket's influence, threatened to seize church lands in England, while Becket responded by excommunicating royal officials and placing England under the threat of interdict. By 1170, political pressure forced a reconciliation. Henry wanted his son, Henry the young king, crowned as his co-ruler, but this required the Archbishop of Canterbury's blessing. To resolve the deadlock, Henry allowed Becket to return to England. However, Becket's return was not one of submission. He continued to defy the king. Furious at Becket's defiance, Henry reportedly lashed out in a fit of rage, exclaiming, "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" Though the exact wording is debated, 4 of his knights, Reginald Fitzurse, Hugh de Morville, William de Tracy, and Richard le Breton, interpreted this as a command. On December 29, 1170, they stormed Canterbury Cathedral, confronting Becket as he prayed. Despite attempts to drag him outside, Becket stood his ground, refusing to submit. The knights struck him down at the altar, splitting his skull with their swords. The murder shocked Christendom, turning Becket into a martyr almost instantly. The fallout was devastating for Henry. Becket was canonized as a saint in 1173, and his shrine in Canterbury became one of Europe's most important pilgrimage sites. Henry, fearing excommunication and rebellion, was forced into public penance. In 1174, he walked barefoot to Canterbury Cathedral, where he was flogged by monks as a sign of repentance. Though Henry had emerged from the Becket crisis with his throne intact, his troubles were far from over. His vast empire required careful management, but his greatest threat came from within his own family. Henry's ambitious plans to divide his empire among his sons created deep resentment. His eldest son, Henry the young king, had been crowned as his co-ruler, but was given no real power. Meanwhile, his younger sons, Richard the Lionheart, Geoffrey, and John, grew restless, each demanding their share of authority. Adding to the tension, Eleanor of Aquitaine, Henry's formidable wife, felt sidelined and resented his treatment of their sons. At the same time, Louis VII of France, still seeking revenge for past defeats, manipulated Henry's sons against their father, offering them support in their grievances. With a fractured royal family and powerful enemies eager to exploit the divisions, the Angevin Empire stood on the brink of civil war. The stage was set for one of the greatest rebellions in medieval history, the Great Revolt of 1173 to 1174, where Henry would face betrayal from those closest to him. Adding to the tension was Eleanor of Aquitaine, Henry's wife and one of the most powerful women of the medieval world. She had always been fiercely independent and felt that Henry favored his illegitimate children and sidelined their sons. Her support for Richard, her favorite son, played a crucial role in what was to come. Meanwhile, Louis VII of France, still Henry's longtime rival, saw an opportunity to weaken the Angevin Empire. He welcomed Henry's rebellious sons to his court, offering them support and a base from which to launch a rebellion. With Eleanor's backing and Louis's aid, the seeds of revolt were sown. By March 1173, tensions between Henry and his sons erupted into open rebellion. The revolt was further fueled by the imprisonment of Eleanor of Aquitaine, who had sided with Richard. In response, Henry ordered her captured and held in confinement, deepening the rift within the royal family. With Louis's support, the young King Richard and Geoffrey secured powerful allies across France and England. Several discontented nobles, including Hugh Becket, Earl of Norfolk, and Robert de Beaumont, Earl of Leicester, joined the cause. In Scotland, William the Lion seized the opportunity to invade northern England, aiming to weaken Henry's hold over his realm. The rebellion quickly became a multi-front war, threatening the entire Angevin Empire, and Henry faced revolts in England itself. For the first time, his rule was truly at risk. Henry's first priority was securing Normandy, the heart of his continental power. By mid-1173, forces loyal to the young king and Richard were besieging key castles, with Louis VII supporting them from the east. However, Henry swiftly launched counterattacks that dispersed rebel forces and secured key strongholds. By late 1173, the rebellion in Normandy was faltering. In Aquitaine and Brittany, Henry's allies, including Ranulph de Glanville and Richard de Lucy, managed to hold firm against Geoffrey and Richard's forces. Though the conflict remained unresolved, Henry successfully prevented his sons from gaining a decisive foothold in their claimed territories. Meanwhile, in England, Henry faced one of the most dangerous threats of his reign, as unrest spread rapidly across the realm. Powerful nobles like Robert de Beaumont, Earl of Leicester, and Hugh Becket, Earl of Norfolk, joined the rebellion, challenging the king's authority and raising forces against him. To make matters worse, William the Lion of Scotland invaded from the north, attempting to capture Northumberland. Despite the overwhelming odds, Henry's commanders Richard de Lucy and Humphrey de Bohun led the royalist forces with great skill. In October 1173, Henry's forces crushed the rebels at the Battle of Fornham, defeating the Earl of Leicester's army and taking him prisoner. Meanwhile, Henry strengthened his defensive line in the north, holding back the Scots and preventing further incursions. By early 1174, the rebellion was beginning to collapse. Henry returned to England, determined to finish the war once and for all. The final blow to the rebellion came in July 1174, when William the Lion was captured at the Battle of Alnwick. His defeat shattered the remaining rebel support in England. With his enemies losing ground, Henry quickly moved to reassert his dominance. One by one, rebel castles fell and noble lords submitted to the king's authority. In September 1174, Henry forced his sons and their allies to negotiate peace. The Treaty of Montlouis ended the rebellion, with Henry forgiving his sons. He also kept Eleanor of Aquitaine imprisoned, preventing her from further inciting rebellion. The Great Revolt of 1173 to 1174 had been one of the greatest threats to Henry's reign, but he had emerged victorious. However, while he had won the war, his family remained deeply divided, and his relationship with his sons would only grow worse in the years to come. In 1180, Philip Augustus became King of France following the death of Louis VII. Though still a teenager, Philip quickly proved to be a shrewd and capable monarch. He inherited his father's hostility toward the Angevin Empire and was determined to reduce English influence in France. Henry, wary of Philip's ambitions, attempted to maintain peace through diplomacy, but Philip skillfully exploited the divisions within the Plantagenet family. Philip began to court Henry's sons, particularly Richard, offering support and influence in exchange for their loyalty. This tactic proved effective, especially as Richard grew increasingly frustrated with his father's refusal to name him heir to the empire. By the 1180s, the old cycle of conflict resumed. Henry the young king died unexpectedly in 1183, but rather than easing tensions, his death intensified the power struggle between Richard and Geoffrey. Geoffrey died in a tournament in 1186, leaving Richard as the eldest surviving son and Henry's obvious successor. However, Henry favored his youngest son, John, whom he hoped to elevate without diminishing Richard's authority. Richard, distrustful of his father and jealous of John's growing prominence, openly aligned with Philip Augustus, forming a dangerous alliance against Henry. By 1189, Philip and Richard launched a joint campaign against Henry and France. Exhausted, isolated, and suffering from illness, Henry was forced to negotiate. The Treaty of Colombières compelled him to acknowledge Richard as his heir. Shortly after, Henry discovered that even John had betrayed him, siding with Richard and Philip during the conflict. Broken physically and emotionally, Henry died on July 6, 1189 at Chinon Castle in Anjou. He was buried at Fontevraud Abbey beside his beloved wife Eleanor. His death marked the end of a long and turbulent reign that had seen the creation of one of the largest empires in medieval Europe. Despite his violent end, Henry's legacy is immense. He restored royal authority in England, implemented legal and administrative reforms, and laid the foundation for English common law. Richard inherited the throne after Henry's death in 1189, becoming King of England at the age of 31. Known to history as Richard the Lionheart, he was already a celebrated military commander with a fierce reputation earned on the battlefields of Aquitaine. Unlike his father, Richard had little interest in ruling England directly. His sights were set on the Holy Land. Within a year of taking the crown, he embarked on the Third Crusade, leaving the governance of his vast empire in uncertain hands. But Richard's reign, though brief, was filled with drama, warfare, and legacy defining moments, both at home and abroad. In the next episode, we'll dive into the story of Richard the Lionheart, his epic crusade, his rivalry with Saladin, and the trials he faced far from home.